When you hear things about old bridges, there are some famous ones that pops in your head, like the 33 Bridge in Iran, the Golden Gate, the London Bridge, and many more. But between all these old bridges, there is one that's extremely famous for its ingenuity, but for the time it was built, the Brooklyn Bridge. Throughout history, humans always tried to shorten their route by building bridges, but unfortunately, throughout history, most bridges that were built collapsed one way or another. And most of them weren't collapsed by the enemy. They collapsed under pressure because they weren't built properly enough, and they weren't maintained. Old cities usually had rivers next to them, but the big problem is passing these rivers without boats. So they started building bridges from every channel. Like in the 17th century in London, which is located next to the Thames River, there was a huge problem with bridges, and they would build them. But the big problem is these bridges would collapse all the time and kill a bunch of people. And in the city of London, it happened plenty of times because they couldn't get it just right. In the 19th century, when the city of New York is expanding, a German engineer by the name of John Roebling announces that this city is lacking a bridge, and a huge bridge is needed to connect Manhattan to Brooklyn. If you're not familiar with New York, Manhattan is an island, and Brooklyn is the mainland, but they're all part of New York. By the time John Roebling is saying this, New York's economy is booming, and there is a lot of trade between Brooklyn and Manhattan, but they don't have access to a bridge, so they ride ferries and boats across the water. After Roebling announced that we need a bridge between Manhattan and Brooklyn, everybody were on board and they said, yes, it's a great idea. But the problem is, when they asked him how this type of bridge is going to be built, John Roebling says, just like older bridge, we're going to build a suspension bridge. When he said that, a lot of critics came out of the blue and made fun of him and said, this type of bridge is never going to work. It's gonna snap the first day. Why did this guy get us excited for no reason? But they didn't understand. The suspension bridge he's talking about is much different than what they're used to. Either way, since John Roebling was a proper engineer, the city of New York told him to come show us what you mean by this design. And when they got familiar with what he's talking about, they were very impressed, and they told him to fully draw out the plan. A few years later, his design is approved, and in February of 1867, the project begins. The most important and hardest part was the two towers that had to be built in the water. Then the entire weight of the bridge will be on these two posts. This is one of the first bridges that does this. At this time, the Brooklyn Bridge was the biggest bridge of all time, 480 meters long. Another design that was completely unique for its time is that John Roebling ordered steel wires, and this was the most important thing to make a bridge this size possible. When the main towers go up, it has a height of 90 meters, and you could say this is the first skyscraper in New York City, and this was also the tallest structure west of the hemisphere, and it was built in water. You have to know that the tallest structure in this time is actually the Great Pyramid of Giza at 139 meters. The main engineer, John Roebling, was always on site, but when the job was going well and he was near the water, a boat came extremely fast and swerved towards his direction, hitting him extremely bad, to a point where they had to cut off his foot. It's also the year 1869, and they don't have proper healthcare. So unfortunately, his foot gets infected, and they don't have any proper antibiotics to get rid of it, and it eventually ends up killing him. But his son that was always with him, and he knew what his father's goals were, he was able to continue the exact vision of his father, so he became the main engineer of the project. It might seem normal to you, but at that time, it seems impossible. It's like building a structure inside the water. But imagine telling someone that in 1869. Roeblen had already gave the design on how to do this. He said we should build giant wooden boxes that would be able to fit a bunch of people in. And then you would put that giant piece of wooden box inside the water, and it's so strong that it will stay there. Then you pump out all the water, leaving that place empty. This was the first time that a bridge tower was built like this inside the water, where they had to dig out the bottom of the bay. The wooden boxes were successful and they were able to build the foundation of these towers. The men that worked down here were having a terrible time. First of all, there was no light, and the only thing that kept the place lit up was candles and kerosene lamps. You might say, why didn't they run lamps in there? Because they weren't able to control electricity yet. There were so many candles and kerosene lamps down there that they made the air extremely dense and it lacked a lot of oxygen. So it ended up killing a lot of people. And the main reason is that it killed a lot of the oxygen, and these men were working long hours. Another huge problem they faced was the steel cables that were ordered. The city of New York had ordered a wrong set of steel wires, something that wouldn't hold the bridge up. Since the wires were too weak, Roeblen's son said we have to replace them. But the city went back and forth with him and said we can't afford it. But eventually they let up and finally ordered the correct wires because it wouldn't work without them. Eventually, in the year 1883, after working on this bridge for 14 years, it was finally ready. Nowadays, the Brooklyn Bridge is the symbol of New York City, and you could kind of consider it a historic piece. And a lot of tourists come to New York City just to see this bridge. The first skyscrapers of New York City were these two, and then the city turned out like this. Like for example, the Empire State, that was the tallest building in the world at a time, was built 40 years after the Brooklyn Bridge. You could say when it was being built, it paralyzed the city of New York. But why is that? Because it was extremely expensive. With the mistakes and extra charges, they ended up paying $15 million for this bridge, which is about $330 million. But that type of money back then was much higher than $330 million today, if that makes any sense. If you've seen our video about the Alaska purchase, you'll know that they bought this vast land for only $7.2 million. Just imagine how expensive this bridge was in this era. You could say after it was finished, New York City was regretful because how expensive it turned out. But it turned out to be one of the best investments they ever made. It made the city thrive more, and it connected Manhattan to the rest of New York for the first time. And you also have to know that this was the most expensive structure at that time.
I'm over you, we lost our minds. Time took over you. I never knew what I was in for. I'm over you, we lost our minds. Time took over you. I never knew what I was in for. I'm over you. Over you.